Hello, everybody. Looks like you're all coming in from the waiting room, which is great. Excellent to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us. My name's Kylie Hanson and I'm a senior consultant at WACOS. And before we start, I just want to also acknowledge that I am joining you today from the land of the Wandjak people, and I want to pay respects to elders past and present. I know that many of you are probably also joining from the same land, but in the event, given it's a webinar, that some of you are not, I just want to also pay respects to all elders, acknowledge that this country is and always will be Aboriginal land. So the series that you're joining us for today, WACOS Wednesdays at 1, this is actually our final one in this first series. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this final one. Wednesdays at 1 is a series of weekly webinars where we address and discuss key issues facing the community services sector across WA. So do keep an eye out for our next series because I think we'll be announcing something on that soon. So in terms of Zoom etiquette, if you can just ensure that you are on mute. I think most people are generally pretty, across the Zoom etiquette these days. And we also encourage you to use the speaker view. So we don't have slides for every single presenter. So speaker view, which is just in the top right-hand corner of your underview options, that would just enable you to be able to see who's speaking a little bit more clearly and easily. So each webinar usually features a presentation from WACOS and some of our key partners, followed by opportunities for conversation and question. And sorry, Lottery West, sorry, there we go. But today's format is a little bit different. So as you would know, today we've got a series of examples of collaboration across the community services sector and lessons that we've learned throughout COVID-19. And so today we have about 11 or 12 presenters joining us in very quick succession, but we do still want to hear from you too though. So please do ask questions in the chat function, share some links, share some examples relevant to what the presenters are sharing, and pop all of that into the chat function. We do try to draw that into the conversation where it's relevant. And so we hope we can have a lively chat happening at the same time as the presentations. And we will make the slides available. That's always one of the very first questions that we get. So we're just going to jump into it. And the first example is me. Okay, so if you can go to the next slide, Ashley. So I'm going to speak to you very briefly about the WA Peaks Forum. So for those of you that aren't aware, the WA Peaks Forum is a forum of the community services sector peak bodies, and we have many of them joining us on the call today. And the Peaks Forum actually during COVID-19 really came together to try to support the community services sector in a joined up, really aggregated way. Some of the things that we did to do that were convening weekly meetings. So we had weekly Zoom meetings where different peaks were sharing, different things about the emergency response and recovery as they were coming to light. We did a lot more than normal coordination of activities and support, obviously making sure that the sector had the information it needed when it needed it and in a very quick kind of way was critical. And so there was a lot more coordination of activity and support. We established a data subcommittee and we've actually started work on coordinating all the different community services directories and how they talk to one another. So it became clear during COVID that sometimes we didn't actually know what services were open, who was accepting referrals, at what capacity they were operating, how they were seeing clients, etc. So some of that service mapping information comes through community services directories. And so we've started an initiative, I suppose, to coordinate that sort of stuff. And we also actually put into place a collaborative grant subcommittee. So Lottery West very generously provides some peak capacity building grants. And ordinarily that is a grant pool, I suppose, that WACOS will make the key decision on, and it's just for peaks, sorry everyone else on the call. But what we actually did is set up a collaborative way of distributing those grants where peak bodies themselves decided where those grants would go based on applications and all of the other kind of process in place. And so that was a really interesting way, and what we learned from that is that different peak bodies actually had different mechanisms and ways of collaborating after learning a bit more about each other and the work that they did through that process. So that was a really interesting experience. And I can highly recommend collaborative grants processes. It was really interesting, but also a democratic way of distributing that cash. And finally, recovery thinking and planning was one of the key things that the Peaks Forum focused on, making sure that any asks and key messages we had around moving into the recovery phase from COVID-19 was coordinated as much as possible. So it's a very brief starting point, and the reason we started with that is just because the weekly webinars actually came out of some of the Peaks Forum work that we were doing. And so it's an example of something that actually led to an outcome that's very practical. I'm now going to hand over again, quick rapid fire succession, to Tina from Volunteering WA, who's going to speak a bit about the impact of COVID on volunteering across WA. So Tina.
Oh, thanks, Kylie. And yeah, thanks for the first slide and everyone that's listening in. Before I sort of get started on the impact, I think it's really good just to give you some context about volunteering in our state. So prior to COVID, there was an estimated 4 out of 5 West Australians volunteering. 34% of those were formal volunteers, and that was for organisations providing services to the community, and then through informal volunteering activities. So as you can see there, there are 3 volunteers for every 1 paid not-for-profit worker. So that's really significant when we look across our state, and makes for a significant workforce. So we have around 600,000 formal volunteers, and their economic, social and cultural value equates to about 39 billion per year, which is a huge amount of value for us living in WA. If I could get the next slide, please. Okay, so we've had, COVID actually had a massive impact on volunteering, with about 70% of programs ceasing to operate overnight. Many of them represented like non-essential services, and those that posed a high risk to volunteers and the community. So many volunteers fell into that high risk age category, and were also required to self-isolate. Those that did continue to volunteer were classified as essential services, so directly supporting vulnerable people in the community and also in our emergency services. So we saw this huge surge in informal volunteering as well. And to assist in this area, Volunteering WA developed an emergency volunteering website to take registrations for people wanting to lend a hand and help out during the crisis. Basically, we had around 4,000 people on that system, and many of them were actually directed to help support emergency services and helping the vulnerable in the community. So we surveyed our membership in August, and so what you see there is what happened in March. So 70% of programs obviously closing. Out of those 30% that continued, those were the ones that were providing essential services. So if we just go forward then to August, what we can see is that about 56% of volunteer programs have returned, but worryingly about 46% are struggling to get restarted, and a lot of that is because of the COVID safe requirements. Some volunteer programs are no longer viable, and also there's quite a big cohort of older volunteers who are either reluctant or unable to return to volunteering. I mean, on a positive note, we're really here to assist those organisations with resources and support and advice in moving those forward. And if I could get the next slide, please. So basically, there's some stats here from our recent member survey. We asked volunteer managers about their programs. They believe that 25% of volunteers would not return. And again, this is concerning, as this cohort does represent those older volunteers who generally support more traditional formal types of volunteering. So in that, what I mean is they might do a regular day or 2 per week. The other thing that we found is that 41% reported that younger people wanted to volunteer, which is great news. But what is obviously a bit of a mismatch is that only 23% of organisations were actually redesigning their roles that suited younger volunteers. So, of course, there's going to be a gap there as well in seeing, you know, in find for those younger people to find positions that they're really happy in. So we're basically helping organisations to redesign positions and to include virtual volunteering and episodic type volunteering, which is more suited to younger people and our future volunteers. On closing, we do face some significant challenges in reinvigorating volunteering and remobilising volunteers. The safety issues are paramount, given the additional costs and admin to manage the health and safety of volunteers. And of course, they're not covered by workers' compensation or volunteer insurance policies during pandemics. We also know that issues are compounded in regional areas due to high unemployment and social isolation. What's important is that we see volunteering as a key preventative measure to support mental health and well-being. It is essential in the social recovery and all aspects of our West Australian community. Interestingly, the ABS stats were released today, and it was pretty bad news in terms of volunteering, in that volunteer figures have dropped by 7%. But more importantly, the hours that people are volunteering has dropped by 20%, which will indicate that those more traditional types of volunteer roles are on the decrease. I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. If not, I will finish there. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Tina. And just a reminder, if you have questions, please pop them into the chat and we'll ask them as we go. I'll look back in case any come through for Tina. But from volunteering through to places and projects where people are volunteering potentially. So I'll hand over now to James Wild from Men's Shed, WA.
You should be on TV with links like that, Kylie. It's superb. Yeah, I just wanted to focus on a couple of projects and a couple of areas that have come out of, particularly to the Peaks Forum and the weekly forums that WACOS have been holding. I won't go through all of the areas that have affected men's sheds throughout this time, but we undertook a survey a few months back in to look at the impacts of COVID on men's sheds and what were the key issues that came out of the sheds and what they were struggling with, really. One of them was that 50% of sheds, or over 50% of sheds, were struggling to engage with their members because there wasn't any opportunity for face-to-face meetings or engagement, and they struggle with online access and capability. That the men's sheds are just the demographic that is kind of the main demographic that accesses sheds is just they don't use the internet, they don't use technology, very few of them have phones. We also found through the COVID survey as well that there's increased pressure on those vulnerable groups and to engage and to provide useful information and support and get that out to the members of the sheds as well. So kind of as a byproduct of the Peaks Forum and the information gathering that Kyla was talking about before, and that communication channel back through to government has been invaluable for men's sheds. But I think one of the really key areas of key benefits for us has been the collaboration with other groups and other peaks through those forums. One of them, in response to that access to technology, has been the Be Connected group. So Link West, Men's Sheds WA, Australian Seniors Computer Club, and the Country Women's Association. Not all of those groups are on the Peak Forum, but through Link West and Men's Sheds WA, we were able to pull a group together fairly quickly. To put an application into Good Things Foundation for Be Connected funding, and we were successful in procuring $100,000 worth of funding to create over 120 digital mentors in our groups across WA, and that really has been the direct result of the collaboration through the Peak Forum. The impact of that will hopefully really counter that kind of social isolation that the men are experiencing, and will support the men sheds to better engage their members, really. And not just the men sheds, the Link West groups and CWA and the like as well. One of the other areas of collaboration that came out of there was through Men's Health and Wellbeing WA. They were successful in the capacity building grant, the peak capacity building grant, to transfer their, you're probably familiar with their Blokes book, which is a directory of health and wellbeing support. They've now they wanted to transfer that onto an online setting, online platform to support men across WA. And through the contact that we had through the Peaks Forum, we saw that Men's Health and Wellbeing were undertaking this project, and it was something that that's really key to the sheds and to support the well-being of the members of the sheds, being there's such a diversity of men in the sheds, but there's so many vulnerable groups that are being supported. So we linked in with Men's Health and Wellbeing WA, provided some funding ourselves into the project because it aligned with our outcomes and aligned with what we wanted to do as an organisation. And through that funding, we also committed some resource into that project, I should say, as well. We put some time into that to create the online directory. So there's now a directory there of health and wellbeing support, crisis services, relationship support, suicide prevention. There's a whole range of online connections for men sheds. So I think that's something that I personally wanted to highlight as perhaps a byproduct of the Peak Forum, which is that collaboration that's come out of those groups, and not understating the value of the group itself in the communication channel, but just facilitating those conversations and sparking ideas where we can go and work with each other and share that information and share kind of projects. So I think that's what I wanted to say.
Great, thank you, James. Two very relevant examples, so thank you for sharing those. And I like the link back to the Peaks Forum and collaboration across Peaks, which is awesome. Yeah. A quick one before I throw to Jenny. Tina, Leela had a question in the chat about people being motivated to volunteer due to wanting to decrease their isolation. Is that something you've also heard?
Sorry, yes, absolutely. Particularly around, there's been a few of our members actually that have been reporting that they have lots of people wishing to volunteer, but I suppose what it comes down to is the type of volunteering that people actually want to do. So there's a big change in that, and I'll be happy to talk about that another time. I know you're short for time right now. Yeah. But if anyone wants to contact me offline, I can talk and talk. I'm going here.
There's a couple of comments in the chat, so if you wanted to respond in chat, Elaine's just asked about some references, so I'll leave that with you if you have a sec to do that in the chat as well. So Jenny, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Jenny Gray, Deputy CEO at WACOS, to talk about collaboration in food relief.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kylie, and hi, everyone. So I'm pretty sure everyone knows about the food relief framework by now, so I'm only going to take 30 seconds to recap that the framework began with the impetus of Lottery West in 2017, that really we needed more efficient and effective ways to deliver charity food to people experiencing food insecurity. And the great thing about this project is that the sector stakeholders agreed that we really could be better coordinated and collaborate more. So WACOS was the lead in this project. We engaged stakeholders around the state, from the bottom to the top, and we developed some interim recommendations which we workshopped in a think tank. The final report was launched by Minister McGurk in 2019, and the report and the recommendations culminated in a roundtable, and that's the picture you've got in front of you, all of the participants at the roundtable, on the 27th of February this year, remarkably 1 week before the lockdowns. And if we'd been 1 week later, none of this would have happened. And you can see, perhaps you can see some of the diversity of people who are represented in that photo. It was the first time that the Coles state manager and the Woolworths state manager had been together in the same room, and they both acknowledged that. We had, in addition to industry participants, we had representation from many service providers that you're familiar with and that you can see there. So the point of this, the roundtable, or what we were able to do from the roundtable, is really leverage some of the relationships that were developed to allow us to respond to the impacts of the pandemic. So the next slide, thanks Ashley. One of the things that we did do was, as a result of the roundtable, is that we were invited to join the Food Security Working Group. And you can see, so this is a very early on diagram of the sort of, I guess, governance structure or, you know, stakeholder structure that was developed by Department of Industry and Regional Development. And you can see WACOS down the bottom, how we fit in there. And that was a result of the roundtable. I have to say there was a degree of negotiation deciding how WACOS actually fit with the Food Security Working Group. It was convened across many state government departments, and it was concerned with the supply of food generally rather than specifically. But we did arrive at a terms of reference point that specifically included WACOS, and I'll just read it out. In order to ensure food supply to vulnerable peoples, work with Department for Communities and WACOS to identify and respond to issues that are beyond the capacity of existing response mechanisms. So in this case, beyond the capacity of the existing retailers. We absolutely did that in the Food Security Working Group. We were able to assist in particular with addressing food supply, charity food shortages in the East Goldfields and the East Pilbara. So from that, I think we can go to the next slide, Ashley. So we all know about the roundtables that were convened early July. We managed to be invited to join this one that you can see on the screen. The invitation, it's got to be said, was reluctant, issued reluctantly in the first instance, and secured only after a degree of badgering in inverted commas. So it was really the development of the Food Stress Index and that maps food insecurity across Western Australia, and in our work responding to place that we were able to use to convince people of our relevance to join that particular roundtable. And you can see that actually it really was a fabulous opportunity, I think, to connect the dots. And the last little excerpt from a letter up on the screen acknowledging that from all of the participants of the roundtable. And just to highlight one idea that took hold in particular and that we've all since seen is the recognition that young people and migrant workers are likely to need support to take up opportunities along the harvest trail. So we've seen the release of the Wander Out Yonder to Work campaign, which includes a financial package to assist potential workers with accommodation and travel expenses. So that was really the work of connecting those dots between food insecurity and the youth roundtables in particular. And I'd encourage anyone else on the chat who has other experiences of roundtables to pop that in as well. Thanks, Kylie.
That's great, thanks Jenny. And definitely if you had experiences where things that you mentioned at roundtables came up or did not come up, as the case may be, we'd love to read that in the chat. So building on what Jenny's just spoken about, Leela James from WACOS is now going to talk more specifically about charity food supply and coordination. So Leela.
Hi everybody. Okay, so I think that was a great introduction, Jenny. So both of my case studies of partnership and collaboration actually exist within the context of the Food Relief Clearinghouse. So that's a subcommittee of Fair Food WA, who are the larger group who developed the Food Relief Framework. Okay, so the first case study really talks about scenario planning. This is an image I'm sure you'll remember from the Melbourne Towers. I think we all watched on with a lot of concern as those towers were locked down because of a COVID outbreak. I think we watched charities and government departments, you know, scramble over each other in an attempt to actually ensure that everybody in those towers had access to their basic necessities. You know, and I think largely the charity sector was seen as the first responders in providing that material aid. You know, it's very heartening to know that as we were watching with concern, so was our state government. So what happened was that we were fortunate that our CEO, Louise, had a seat at the table with the State Welfare Emergency Committee. And that enabled us to have a relationship with the State Welfare Incident Controller. And you know, scenario planning really sat within the committee of the State Welfare Incident Controller. So in an effort to ensure that WA, should it have a localised outbreak, wouldn't see these types of events unfold here, the State Incident Welfare Controller actually reached out to WACOS and talked to us about how they might do some scenario planning. Because of the, you know, our relationship to convening the Food Clearinghouse Group, which is made up of all the largest distributors and last mile deliverers, such as OzHarvest, Food Bank and Second Bite, and Salvation Army and Vinnie's, we were able to bring them all together so they could test some of their scenario planning. And, you know, just one such outcome of that scenario planning, if we can go to the next slide, Ashley, is that these providers told the state government that without a doubt, they are not the first responders in an incident where there's a localized lockdown. And in fact, if state government is going to lock down an area, then it's state government's responsibility to ensure that those people have access to nutritional, adequate and culturally appropriate food. So that actually led to Department of Communities purchasing and ensuring that there are 500 nutritional food boxes being stored right now that will enable a first response for that first week of first few days of a lockdown. So that when, if such thing was to occur here, we would see a much more coordinated response. So, I mean, and then of course, those relationships that have been formed between government and providers and WACOS, I think they're going to go on to provide more value to government planning into the future. We're ready for the next one, Ashley. Okay, so this one came through to Jenny. I think Jenny received a call from a minister's office to say that Venues West at Optus Stadium had made 20,000 meals, pre-packed, nutritional, ready-to-move meals for the charity food system. And this at first thought just sounds amazing, right? However, if you go back to the food relief framework, you'll remember that one thing that the charity food system lacks is logistics systems. So moving 20,000 meals might be easier said than done. Again, because the clearinghouse group was convened, you know, and was meeting on a weekly basis throughout the initial lockdown and now on a fortnightly basis, between them being led by OzHarvest, they were able to share their logistics systems, the three big providers, so that's OzHarvest and Food Bank and Second Bite, were able to share the logistics systems and ensure that those 20,000 meals were stored and distributed to those frontline providers. So again, those frontline providers, Salvation Army and St. Vincent de Paul and many other providers, Linkwest community centres, you know, all of these last mile distributors were able to send this food into place. So, you know, I think that these are really great examples and really great achievements and outcomes that I think is fortunate that we've been in this place for such a long time that we're able to, oh, sorry, that was my timer. Anyway, I'm done. If you want to know any more information about any of this, just give me an email or let me know.
Amazing. Gold standard, Leela, for timing yourself. Excellent work. Any questions for Leela, please pop them in the chat. She can either respond there or we'll loop back and ask them. While they're coming through, hopefully, I'm going to hand over to Lorna and I believe Nikki instead of Vari at Lottery West, who'll speak briefly to a working in partnership, working in collaboration workshop that was held recently. So I'll hand over to Lorna and Nikki, I think.
So I think it's just me.
Just Lorna. Hello, Lorna.
Okay. Can you see me? Oh yeah. So yeah, a couple of weeks ago, Lottery West and Department of Communities held a workshop with about 75 stakeholders. We had NOUS come in and facilitate, and it was really just pouncing on an opportunity to bring a collective together to really look at, firstly present our COVID program, have a look at the state recovery strategy plan, and really target looking at building a shared understanding of local issues and priorities. We would have liked to have had it a lot more open, but was kind of a pilot to see how it would go, see what the interest was, and see what we might be able to achieve in half a day. So it was probably a better outcome than what we had expected. We did some brainstorming, we put people in groups, the department focused on using the district leadership group kind of structure, which was a great idea. And no surprises in terms of having NOUS facilitate and look at the how might we, which really generated some really great ideas and solutions, which were similar across all regions, all of the areas across Perth. So we had some really great ideas where we don't want to lose the momentum of that in regards to where to next. We really want to pounce and grab those ideas. So no surprises at the sector, community sector, very proactive, and we've already got an application in to do some further scoping from an outcome from that workshop. So the issues that were mainly raised across the Perth metro area that are very similar were young people, homelessness, and the new cohort impacted by COVID, so the newly unemployed, who are really foreign to even know where to start looking for services. So the community connectors was the shared solution, so I really don't want us to lose the momentum of that and the energy behind the people that came together. Some really great ideas on how we could look at taking that to the next stage in terms of activating some community connectors, and well, I mean, really they're needed now, more so than in 12 months' time. So we do have something before us to look at scoping and taking that to the next level. Lottery West are going to look at continuing to do something like this with other government agencies and their key sector stakeholders, so such as DPC and Department of Local Government, Sport and Culture, and others. So if there's anything where you think there might be groups that want to come together and have conversations. I know, James, we've had one with you recently in reference to some of the ideas you've got where we can bring collectives together, look at some shared solutions, and Lottery West can provide some support to kick that off or to look at piloting it for whatever period of time. Then please stand up, come forward, and we're happy to have that conversation. Just quickly, we did have our closing date for strengthening org capacity, and we were really rapt to see we received over 200 applications across the board, mainly IT, which is what we were really encouraging, for how can you strengthen your organisation to be delivering services from what you've learnt, or the lessons learned. Let's put them into the positive approach forward. There were quite a few with innovation services, and a few in collaboration, which is fine. We also received, over the 200 applications received, it's a $10 million pot of money, and we received about 30 mil in requests. That's fine, we'll continue to work with everybody. So great to see, and I think Penny's going to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Lorna. Penny, given Department of Communities were a partner in that workshop, did you have something to add?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the great presentations as well. It's always insightful, and it's great to get together. I don't have too much to add from what Lorna's already said, but certainly there was no shortage of ideas, and the purpose of the workshop was very much about strengthening them. I guess what struck me most was that despite the diversity in organisations and backgrounds, community connection, new entrance to the services sector, how people navigate that, even though groups are independently, that seems to be a really strong common theme, but also recognising, well, new money might be part of that solution that we're rich in you know, thinking about what existing community assets that we can leverage at a local level. So I'm a great believer in place-based solutions and commissioning, etc. So I think a lot of the solutions lie in there rather than whole of government necessarily driving everything. And as Lorna said, this is a process that was something new that we were trying based on the district's local partnerships. So there were organisations participating, some that we contract with, many that we don't. We're also in discussion with Lottery West and our Aboriginal outcomes area around a specific workshop for ACCOs across the state, because you know, that would be fantastic to pull off. So lotteries will be leading that. What else was I going to say there? Anyway, like I said, it was bringing people together. It was about that kind of collective impact, and it's always wonderful when you get a group of like-minded mission-driven people together that you know, agency agendas were kind of left at the door, and everyone was really thinking as a whole community. So it was really us partnering with lotteries to try something different. There was, you know, some really solid feedback, whereas if we do something in the future, we can continue to refine that. There was an insights report that was developed from NOUS. Really happy to share that if anyone has an interest in the outcomes. There's no secrets there. That's all really from me. Really pleased with how it went, and thank you for those that participated.
Thanks so much, Penny. And I think that the next lead-in is a really useful one, because it illustrates some of the examples that actually came out of that collaborative working. So I'm going to hand over now to Amanda Hunt from Uniting WA and Kate Cheney from Anglicare WA. I'm not sure who's going to speak first or what, but I'll just hand over to you both.
Let's see, this is a pure example of collaboration, because we're doing this presentation together. And Kate and I are really just going to be talking about what we've kind of sensed out of the system, and really the goal of what all of you are hoping to achieve, which is really, how do we connect and harness the collective strengths of all your different community groups, our different community citizens, and really to support, I think you referred to, Penny, people who were new to the experience of vulnerability. I guess our goal is really looking at how do we make sure that people don't enter the system? How do we make sure that we're keeping community strong, not we're keeping community strong, but how is community keeping themselves strong? So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, and so I guess we'd worked on some hypotheses, and then going to the session with Lottery West and Department of Communities really reinforced some of these, and that is, you know, firstly, that there's this new cohort of people as a result of the economic impact of COVID, who don't see themselves as service users, might be able to be, you know, more equipped to use self-service or light touch models, and really need information. And then another hypothesis there is they probably just don't know how to find that information, and so that leads to this community connectors idea. And it was fascinating that at that workshop, I think 6 of the 11 ideas were about this community connector model. And so that led us to have some conversations about you know, what's actually needed to activate and equip community connectors. And obviously we're going to need multiple different approaches, and there are lots of different potential providers of that community connector function, both formal and informal. So if it's formal, it could be community resource centres, local governments, sporting clubs, men's shared, you know, service providers. There's a whole range. But then we're thinking, what are they going to need? If it's informal, it's also probably the head of your P&C or your friend from school, or, you know, those informal connectors also need some support. So we've had some conversations, and Amanda's prepared an application for Lottery West to looking at what that backbone function could be. And then we're also, we've developed, I'd love to give you all some homework. We've developed a website called your2020story.com, which is around head, heart and pocket, which is kind of that really light touch, high level information that people might need to point them in the right direction as they're, you know, navigating new unemployment and the impact of that both on mental health, relationships, and that financial need as well. So any feedback on that I'd really love. And so we had a meeting, and we've put that up as a potential resource that can be improved upon, and happy to brand it however everyone wants to brand it, to share that, so that we're starting to build a bank of resources that community connectors can use no matter where they sit. The other thing we're working on is Friend in Need, which is an app which is really targeted at people to support their own informal networks. So if you've got a friend who's having a crisis, what do you need to know as a friend? And it also destigmatises that help seeking, which is something we see is really important now as well. So we've got a few things like that. Another thing that we've talked about is hyper-local service directories. So service directories are really useful. When in the research that we've done about how people actually seek help, so often you want to find a counsellor or something who's been recommended by someone you know. So how do we actually build that capability so that, and probably through partnership with an existing service directory, so people can add notes or stuff onto it for their own personal recommendations. So there are a bunch of ideas. I don't think we're really clear on what the future direction is, but there's definitely some appetite to ensure that we're respecting the multiplicity of approaches that will be needed, but also trying not to reinvent the wheel, and ensure that we're providing more support rather than making it a more confusing space.
And that's the point as well that Kate said, is that whatever this is that we are all embarking on is not a model, it's not a service. It's very much a community reaching out to community, because what we learned from COVID is that people do care. So a number of organisations you would have seen came together and did the Perceptions on Poverty survey. And what we found out of that was, and I see that Miles is here as well, so, and really acknowledging the work that Anglicare put in this, was that 75% of the people in West Australians really do support and people to be staying above the poverty line. We know that last week JobSeeker went below the poverty line, leaving 250,000 people now at risk. And so what we want to do is make sure that any people who are experiencing some kind of vulnerability and hardship are kept safe, kept strong, and kept secure by their community. And I think this is why we need to be thinking of, as Kate said, multiple ways, because we all know that the answer is not service delivery. The answer is community. The answer is people. And it's about making sure that we keep people strong before they are trapped in the welfare system. So we want to make sure that people are safe and strong. Our time's up, Kate.
Amazing. Thank you so much, both. I think there's some really good thought provokers and conversation starters in terms of this community connector space. I know so many organisations are really starting to think about how we progress this. So it was really good as a starting point. And again, I encourage you, and thank you, Elaine and Michaela, for doing so. Ask questions in the chat. And if you have any additional things you want to add around the community connectors, please do pop it in there. So I'm now going to pass over to Michelle McKenzie from Shelter WA, who's going to speak a bit about collaboration in the housing and homelessness sector. So Michelle.
Oh, thanks, Kate, and hi to everyone. As many of you would know, there was an enormous impact on the housing and homelessness sector. Frontline staff, service delivery had to be done a different way, service continuity, and COVID brought out the best in the sector from my perspective, and it really redefined and reinforced the value of collaboration and hopefully the role of peak bodies in supporting the sector through advocacy and alignment. So when COVID hit, we got many calls from our members. We moved swiftly, and we initially had Zoom, and that's our Zoom from March. We had over 80 orgs who just got together to chat. What are you doing? How are you doing it? And we formed a collaborative group that met weekly, and we really identified the collective issues. They were documented, what outcomes the sector need to support themselves, and we tracked progress. That was really important. We reached out to beyond our sector, so we got some of the fabulous public health professionals like Lisa Wood and Andrew Davies involved. They tapped into their international experts, what had happened in England, because they were ahead of us. And we learned from their international collaborations to support what we were doing collaboratively. One of the really great things was the peer-to-peer support. So we've got, you know, Amanda's on the line. Amanda would say, look, this is what we're doing. Would you like my policies? Would you like my procedures? How can I help you? I kept hearing that all the time. How can I help? What do you need? The smaller groups were helping the larger groups and vice versa. The regions were saying, look, we're a bit stuck here. What are you doing in the metro area and vice versa? It was just absolutely magnificent. Specific issues around specific groups like rough sleepers, so groups coalesced around those, boarders and lodgers and congregate living, working groups worked on that. It was unbelievable. We also worked collaboratively with government. The Department of Finance were amazing. They listened to the pressures around PPE, contracts, etc. They moved swiftly. The mayors, the whole rental issue, fantastic staff who listened and said, look, let's see how we can work together. And the Department of Communities formed the COVID-19 homelessness group, and our collaborative group fed into that. It was great. We had co-chairs, so Gordon Cole from Nungamaya co-chaired with Tiffany Allen. There were some challenges and tensions, in particular in the way that rough sleeping was addressed. But we had a vehicle to talk through those challenges. There was the Hotels from Heart pilot. We knew there were very different responses in the other states, but we were mature enough to sit down with government and say, look, we've got a certain framework, it might be different to yours, how can we work together? And we're still working through that at the moment. We were pleased to be invited on the Premier's Recovery Roundtable to represent the sector, and also the Housing Construction Roundtable. And if I look at Lorna, our Lottery West friends, you know, government was amazing, providing support to the sector and moving swiftly. It really, to me, reinforced the value of colleagues and other peaks. So working with Yakwa and WACOS, it was just amazing. You know, what are you doing? What are you hearing in your sector? How can the mental health or whatever support the housing and homelessness area? That network up through National Shelter was just critical in terms of, you know, what's happening in Victoria and New South Wales that we could then learn from, and then work with our sector to pick up the good learnings. If I reflect, certainly at the service level, I know services work really collaboratively with people with lived experience. Probably at the system level, to me, they were the group that missed out in terms of really informing a system response. So, you know, some good learnings that we can take away from it. But in summary, exhausting, huge impact on service delivery, a service system that were unbelievable. You know, they changed within 24 hours. They were nimble, agile, responsive, client focused, peer supportive. There was no egos. It was how can we all work together collaboratively. And picking up what Amanda said, people do care. Our sector cares, the community cares. And I think COVID hopefully shifted the dial moving forward. I think that's me. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And another great example of a subsector of the sector that really came together and was able to mobilize very quickly and just, you know, get ego out of the way and get onto it for the best for the community, really, which I am sure is also what Jill will speak about. So I'll introduce Jill Rundle now from WANADA, who's going to speak a bit about collaboration specifically in the AOD sector. So Jill.
Thank you, Kylie, and thank you all for participating. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where we're meeting today. I'm on Wajak Noongar Budja, so would like to pay respects to elders past and present. I think that the key thing to working in partnership is that many of the people that WANADA's worked with, certainly we have a common vision. We're all working with either existing or emerging vulnerable population groups. Certainly people with problems associated with alcohol and other drug use are at high risk of infection, transmission, complications during the pandemic. So they're already health compromised, as many people in the community sector are. The alcohol and other drug service sector predominantly focuses on tertiary harms. So the sector has been united in identifying itself as providing critical services. So they focused on maintaining service continuity wherever possible, ensuring safety of consumers, staff and the community. WANADA's focused its support on on the maintenance of the critical alcohol and other drug service system as such. As Michelle spoke about, there's been so many partnerships that have contributed to this, and learnings from cross-sector and the collaborations of the WA Peaks Forum as well as government. If I could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. During the pandemic, WANADA conducted a range of additional coordination, system support, representation activities. These are just some of those, and they happened while we were also continuing with ongoing government reform, policy development, capacity building initiatives. The practice sharing we did, WANADA supported specific service types to come together within the alcohol and other drug service sector, so residential services, non-residential services, etc., to come together to share what their approach will be. This was very early in the pandemic. So it provided a lot of reassurance to the services about their approach or their strategies in moving forward. So it was, we also undertook surveys. We had a national survey of services to identify the impact on them during this pandemic. And we also undertook a survey of service users as well to see how they were impacted in terms of service access, engagement, just general well-being. And we were able to match these with other jurisdiction figures as well. I won't go through the whole list, but certainly maintaining a watchful brief on what service demand, what pressures were, and providing that service status updates to inform referrals, a key thing that we were able to do. If I could go to the next slide, please. Lessons learnt from services. So most non-residential services moved very quickly to providing remote care. So one lesson learnt there was that delivering remote care is quite resource intensive, and certainly the feedback that we received was that workers had to work even harder to establish that therapeutic alliance, for example. This impacted on wait lists and people who needing to engage longer, so had an impact on future demand. Next slide, please. Lessons learned from service users. From the survey, we got some fantastic information from the service users about their state of being. Some of the suggestions, I will just go to those for improvements from their perspective, from the service users' perspective. They were really hoping for or suggested some improved sector promotion to inform access pathways. They suggested increased strategies to reduce isolation and to enable that connection, to make up for the gaps in reduced face-to-face service options that would support that connection. They also suggested improved communications between services to enable more improved cross-sector supports. Next slide, please. Thank you, Ashley. So lessons from WANADA. I think a key take-home message is that while many of the issues in the system's failings were exacerbated during COVID, we found very clear, it was quite clear to us that it wasn't worth taking shortcuts. We needed to maintain the service and the consumer co-production and co-design to inform even the rapid responses. And I think that as a foundational process, that would have saved a lot of time, because many of the things that were introduced in a top-down way needed unpicking quite significantly. The sector's response has been amazing. I think the resilience and their continued professionalism, compassion, it's just been very inspiring, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jill. I think that was another good example of what's happening specifically in a sector in a bit more detail, which was amazing. Can you just skip to the next slide, actually, Ashley? I don't think I'll speak to this in a whole lot of detail, but I do just want to highlight the fact that collaboration, not just obviously across the community services sector, but across sectors. So the Impact Investment Alliance is a market development sort of group looking at the development and stewardship of impact investment across Western Australia. And the WA Social Enterprise Council actually mobilised through COVID because social enterprises, so businesses that trade to fulfil a mission, came together to effectively say, look, we need to come together, we need to support one another, and actually put on the table that not only is it important to buy local, but it's also important to buy social. And I think in recovery, and particularly thinking about what we're seeing with COVID recovery, thinking about how we can support organisations that are, you know, businesses, but are trading to actually achieve some sort of social outcome or good at the same time, is a really important element of how we can move forward in recovery and regenerate the economy, right? So I think that's all I'll say on that, but if anyone has questions on that, they're more than welcome to. And I just thought I'd open it up for any additional questions that anyone on the call might have, or additional examples that link to some of the examples that you've heard about throughout the webinar. None? No?
Kylie, I forgot to mention some fabulous work that Kate Chaney led.
Please.
Is that okay, Kate?
Yeah, I think the DG is being briefed today, so maybe in general terms.
So Kate supported the COVID-19 homelessness task force through some scenario planning exercises, and she managed to broker some corporate support for some modelling. And it was just brilliant because you know, there's multiple features all the time, and in a COVID uncertain world, it was just great to sit back and say, well, if this were to happen, how do we prevent Tsunami X, or if this were to happen, how do we prevent Tsunami Y? And wonderful example of Anglicare sharing Kate with the broader sector to deliver a really significant piece of work. So little micro example of magnificence. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think that, you know, is the other key thing, drawing the corporate sector into the work, or not into the work, but as in just ensuring that they can think a little bit about the impact that corporate sector has and the connections that we have and how we can leverage those for the good of our sector, particularly because so many of them are looking to create that kind of impact, particularly at this time. Sudi has got a question. Any lessons learned around family and domestic violence? So any presenters that might speak to that?
It's unfortunately more of a question. One of the things that we're trying to look at the moment is, with the economic impact of COVID, what does that mean for, well, specifically the other services areas that we're in? And we have found some research that shows when unemployment goes up, FDV goes up as well. But if anyone has any sort of academic sources or anything that we can put numbers around, one of the lessons we found from the homelessness modelling is, as soon as you start putting numbers on things, even if there are a lot of assumptions built into there, it does focus the attention a little bit on the size of the challenge that we're looking at. So I think you know, we're now trying to extrapolate from that to other areas. So if anyone has any resources, I'd really welcome them.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kate. If anyone does have anything that you're not able to share in the chat now, if you want to share that afterwards with us, we can get that out to people as well. If there's no
Kylie, just one last one. It's Penny here. Just in terms of support tools to help people navigate the community services sector and the role of WA Connect, it just might be useful to give a bit of a status update and the gap that it seeks to fill.
Absolutely. Thank you. So WA Connect is the whole of community services directory. So acknowledging that many subsectors have directories, which Kate also alluded to. I guess what WA Connect is trying to do is pull that information up and ensure that we've got a picture of what the service map, the service requirements, who's operating, you know, that stuff I spoke to before, who's referring and what kind of capacity are they working. So that in the case that we do have a second phase, a second wave of COVID, or really any other kind of emergency situation, we're in the situation where we actually know what's happening with our services, and we know how to effectively refer, and more importantly, that people on the ground can actually find the services they need. So we're at the moment looking at a data request that's out to the sector, and in fact I might make that available to you again as part of sending the information out after the webinar. So we just really appreciate your support in terms of making sure service information is up to date, so that we can be sure that in the event of another emergency, we've got the information to people who really need it when they need it. I might draw it to a close there, given we're just on 2 o'clock. So I really want to very gratefully thank all of the presenters for the time that they put into preparing, and sometimes not, but also being here and sharing your wisdom and knowledge and experiences. And I hope that, you know, for everyone that attended, there's some lessons learned that you can draw from here in terms of thinking about collaboration moving forward out of COVID too. I think, as the presenters alluded to, there's been so much that people have just come together and done, which maybe before institutionally we would have said, oh, there's these barriers, but yeah, like obviously COVID has shown that we don't necessarily have those in place. So let's think about how we all move forward in that sense. So thanks again to all presenters. Thanks again for everyone for being here, and keep an eye out for our next series.
Oh, sorry, big thanks to you. Big thanks to you. This is Kylie's last week at WACOS. Kylie's been instrumental in organising and herding the WACOS staff and others to the webinars extraordinaire. Thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you in other ways.
Thank you, Jenny. And thanks everyone. Have a good rest of the day.